Are we live?
Yeah, we're good.
All right.
Go ahead.
I'm Pastor Sheila, and I am the interim associate pastor. I'm kind of the substitute teacher filling in for Pastor Matt until you have a new associate pastor. And I started on May 1st.
I'm Karen, Natterstead, last name, and I started August 1st, following your last interim lead pastor, Jim Holmberg, who stepped in after Pastor Chris left a year ago, August. Huh? So yeah, that's we're your long-term sub pastors, and. As you all know, Pastor Ann, and she said because you know her so well, she wasn't going to sit up here with me. We think you could fire a question at her and see what she does with it. So.
It's called Meet the Pastors. I thought I was old news.
Oh, you're always good news.
It's always good news. Yeah. Well, I'll just. This is an informal conversation. Maybe we'll just kick off with a little. What would they like to know about us, Sheila? And then,
Well, there was a question.
We're going to questions already.
Well, there was so the first question. She gets the first question. She asked it before, so we can kick off.
Awesome. What was
she wanted to know about our education?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to know where you got your education.
Yeah.
Can I make one suggestion really
Sure.
quick? Since we're keeping this casual, maybe because both of you are relatively newer, maybe you want to introduce yourself when you ask a question, and I help you to connect with.
Thank you, Sue.
people with
I like that
Since we
idea.
have no name tags, and yeah.
So, what is your name and what is your question?
I'm Marilyn Day, and I'm wondering where you got your education.
Thank you, Marilyn. I'll go first. So I am a Minnesota-born and educated person. I grew up in a town in southeast Minnesota called Owatonna, the only daughter with 4 brothers, and I loved singing and sang in the high school choirs, and of course that's how you make your really informed decision about your higher education. You do what you love, and so I went up to Concordia College, one of our ELCA colleges, with the hopes of singing in the choir. I tried to be a music major twice, flunked out, and suddenly got the call to maybe consider ordained ministry instead. I followed that trail right away and went from college to Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. That's where I graduated from seminary. It's a 4-year degree, both pastors, that's typical. And my internship got me into Wisconsin. So I was assigned to a 3-point parish on the west side of Madison in a town of Black Earth. Mazomanie was that little area. Got really. Hey, really?
Yeah, yep. I went to elementary school in Black Earth. And,
maybe I was your intern.
we didn't attend church there, but yeah.
But you know the community.
I do, yeah. Yep. I went to Black Earth Elementary and then moved back into Madison for middle school. So
there you go.
The shoebox. The
shoebox that my mother loved to come visit because the shoebox.
Yep.
So it's easily half hour into Madison.
Yep.
So I was single and very lonely, having left the school context, and was in Madison often.
Yes.
Finding things and friends to hang out with. And because of that experience in southern Wisconsin, I was assigned to the Greater Milwaukee Synod, and started my ministry here. I'll go over later.
I was not born in Minnesota, but I am Minnesota educated as well. I'm from Libertyville. It's a suburb of Chicago. It's one town south of Great America. And I come from a long line of St. Olaf graduates. And I was taken on the tour of campus, and I thought all the buildings looked oppressively the same. And so I went over to Carleton, and that felt just about right. So I went to Carleton. And then after college, I did a year of Lutheran Volunteer Corps in Milwaukee. And then I went back to Minnesota for seminary. I went to Luther Seminary as well. And I did a short rural ministry internship-y experience with a 5-point parish in eastern North Dakota. And then I did internship for reals in Everett, Washington. And then I did internship last, and so I wound up with, like, I was done with all of my education and I was fully qualified, but the wheels of the church turned slowly, so I wasn't eligible to get a call until the bishops met. You know, so I had time to kill, and so I ended up being I wasn't the interim associate because I wasn't ordained. I think we said my title was like pastoral assistant or something like that, but I was functionally the interim associate at a large church in Kirkland, Washington. And what was neat was it was my grandfather's church. So my grandpa has since passed, but he was a retired pastor. And so I got to give communion to my grandpa every week, and he got to be like, "That's my granddaughter." And and he would always be teased by his pastor friends that he had a granddaughter who went to the heathen school because there was the crosstown rivalry, and he'd be like, "Yeah, but that one became the pastor." Because many of my sister and my cousins went to St. Olaf, but none of them are pastors.
Can you explain 3-point and 5-point?
Yeah, it's when it's more typical in rural, but it's becoming more of the common in urban settings and even suburban a little, where one pastor serves multiple churches. And so the 5-point parish, the way it worked was they had a parish nurse, and they had he was in the team program. So they had a like synodically authorized minister. So he was a layperson, but he was going to distance seminary, so he was kind of learning to be a pastor as well. And then they had me for about 4 months. And between the three of us, there was the North Circuit and the South Circuit. And so when I would go to preach, I would either do the North Circuit, which would be a 45-mile round trip. I'd start in my town and then drive north 15 minutes to get to, which is 15 miles, to get to a church, and then I'd lead worship, and then it was go in peace, serve the Lord, gotta go. And then you go to the next church, and then you lead worship. You slide in time to give the greeting, and then it's go in peace, serve the Lord, gotta go. And then you go and you hustle over to the next church. Some churches put more of a grace period between worship services than others. I had a colleague who served 2 churches that were both very inflexible about their worship times. They were like, this is when it is. And he's like, I literally cannot make it from point A to point B without speeding. So will you pay for my tickets if I get them? They're like, they won't pull you over. So it was just you drive wearing your robes in those cases. And then the southern route was a 100-mile round trip where I drive to the first church and then to the second church and then back home. And so different church arrangements, different ways. So like this particular 5-point parish saw themselves as a parish. So they had a part-time secretary at the largest church who put together the newsletter for the whole parish. And they had a parish council that met every month, sort of in lieu of the regular council. Each church has a certain amount of autonomy. So it's kind of like the federal government and the state governments, and different states have different understandings of how much power they should have. And so you sometimes have partnerships where the only thing they share is paying the pastor. And they don't have hardly anything to do with one another. And sometimes they do a lot of things together. But it's a way of making sure that churches that are too small to call their own pastor have access to pastoral leadership. Someone is there to preach and preside at communion, and then also to be there for pastoral care. Another thing is, do you have like one confirmation class where you're like, okay, everybody drive to this central point, or do you have, there's a bunch of different ways it can play out. But it's a really good stewardship option for, especially when there's quite a bit of distance. Each of these churches, because each of these towns, and each of the towns, the big town had 200 people, the little towns had 50 or less.
You mentioned it as a suburban model. If you're familiar with 2 ELCA churches in Brookfield, are now Unity Church. It was Cross of Life and Christ the King. And they did it for the sake of mission. They realized they brought different gifts, and they did all that hard work of actually, well, they're a merger, but they're 2 campuses with 1 congregation. And so when you mentioned that it was kind of a survival practice in some of the rural areas, but now it's almost becoming, well, maybe survival, but also it definitely has to be mission driven. So yeah, that is maybe the future of the church.
And in the rural areas, part of it comes from when there just weren't as many pastors. And so like the circuit rider pastor, there's some of that where the first parish that I served was St. Michael's in Hustisburg, Wisconsin, and they were the first year I came, they were celebrating their 150th anniversary, and for years they didn't have a pastor. They had a pastor. They for a while have a pastor from Fond du Lac would come down like 2 Sunday afternoons a month, and they'd have church. So they would, as a congregation, they had always just had church whenever they could get an ordained person to stop. So they weren't necessarily in a formal multi-parish model so much as it was they would make arrangements for almost more like a pulpit supply thing, where they would just gratefully take a sermon when they could get one. And so there were some of them, I'd ask, like, what are you most proud about, and they'd be like, we have church in the morning. Good question?
Just curious, does the ELCA ever suggest or insist on these partnerships, or is it always coming from the churches? Okay.
Suggest, but they can't insist.
Sure.
But it's usually from the congregation.
Yeah.
So my first call was in Racine, and when I started there, you may know the history of the ELCA, probably some other denominations. It's very ethnically kind of European conclaves would come and start their own churches. So even in 1988, 87, there were like 6 ELCA, when the ELCA merger happened, there were 6 ELCA churches within a half mile from each other. And that even 30 years ago, that conversation was starting, like, do we need this many buildings? And this, and there have been very slowly some mergers suggested or really implemented.
Yeah, I live in Kenosha, so I know a little bit about Racine, and so it's been within the last, 5 years, maybe a little bit more, that those conversations finally bore fruit, that there are, I think, 3 different congregations that are merger congregations, where 2 or 3 congregations decided to partner, and each of them has a different story and a different way that they did that. In some cases, all 3 sold their buildings and they're renting a third, like a brand new site, or they assessed which building made more sense. Well, we love our building, but your building is handicap accessible, so we're going to go with your building because we all know that at some point our knees will be glad we made this choice, and all kinds of different things. Some of them in Kenosha, there were 2 churches that finally became one parish over a long period of time, where they had been separate congregations, but one had like a 1/4 time pastor and the other had like a 3/4 time pastor, but they were different pastors. And when the 1/4 time pastor retired, they asked the other guy, to pick it up. And so they were functionally 2 completely separate congregations that had just agreed to pay the same person to preach. And then over the years they had, conversations about because they were both very small congregations, and what brought them together was the pastor invited both churches to come on the same day to serve breakfast at a third church, which does a meal for anyone who's hungry that day. And so they really got to know each other around the griddle and the dishpans, and serving and being the hands and feet of Christ together is what brought them to realize that for the sake of the mission, it wasn't worth the money of having 2 different buildings, and they really should just figure out how to be church together so that they could focus more of their time and energy on the service that they had really grown to do together.
My name's Laura, and I wonder, if you were leading an adult education not about yourselves, what topic would you choose? Like, what's your passion?
You can answer that one too.
I tend to get excited about I'll just be honest. I love application. Just how are you doing in daily life? So I've enjoyed, I pitched to Sue, I'd like to do how to plan a good funeral. That is really interesting. I love to do parenting classes. I think that's just a great role the pastor can partner with the youth and family ministry to just say, okay, parents, you're doing a good job getting your kids connected. How are you growing in your faith? I love to do, now that you're planning for retirement, I found that really interesting. And of course it was selfish. I was in my own journey towards that decision and finding those people. I just think those life application conversations are more interesting to me. This is the confession. I'll be honest, I'm the pastor. I get kind of overwhelmed with heavy theological discussions. They can go round and round and round, and I walk away going, huh? So I tend to live more over an application world. Great question.
Yeah. Thank you, Laura. I'm writing all this down.
Oh, good.
See Pastor Karen about that more often.
Pastor Ann, I want you to answer that one.
I've really enjoyed teaching the Wednesday morning Bible study since Pastor Matt left. And I kind of wish there was a way to have a regular Bible study on Sunday mornings. But what I like most about that is hearing what you all have to say about that, or hearing your questions about that. And we're reading through the Gospel of Luke right now, and being able to do that in such a, we only make it through a couple verses a week, but going through it so meticulously, it opens my eyes all over again to how amazing the Bible is, and how just I wish that all of us were more biblically literate and could see ourselves in those ancient stories, and see the connections that are all throughout, and how amazing those writers are, and did you know that this is the same word that they use over and over and over again, and this is what it really means, to just kind of, I love seeing the look on people's faces when they kind of realize, oh my gosh, this is the Bible? This is so great. And it's yeah. It's not just, a book on your shelf that you never get out. It's for your life and for your identity, and so that's my favorite thing to do. And so Wednesday morning has been great for me, but I kind of wish that there was a Sunday morning one too, because not everybody can make it to Bible study at 10 a.m. on a Wednesday. You know.
And I would ask because I'm not really sure. I am interested in a ton of different things, and so I guess I would be most interested in leading adult forums that people would want to attend, that you would see as a valuable thing. And I like learning, and so if I don't already know about something, I would be happy to go and research it, because I love learning new things and getting to know people's stories. Those are some of the things that I enjoy about being a pastor, is that you encounter so many different people and so many different life stories, and you're privileged to be brought into a depth of people's lives that is rare outside of your close friends and family. And so, I don't know, facilitating maybe something where it's not just experts speaking, but finding a way for more of a shared collaborative thing to talk about a topic and to open it up so that you guys can share. I don't know, what would be a point, like, what's your favorite hymn and why, and to hear those stories of how a particular hymn makes you go immediately back to a specific thing or something like that. Or, what are your fondest memories of being in the church? Or one of the questions I asked the staff at the first staff meeting was, what's your favorite room in the church and why? This is a huge building with all kinds of nooks and crannies and fun little surprises, like this spiral staircase behind the organ. And I'd be curious to know what memories you have attached to different rooms, and I don't know.
I would also like to teach whatever class it is that gets us on a trip to Israel at the end.
I would teach a class. I am way back, long before we were going to have a pandemic, I was really fascinated by, I remembered my great aunts coming back from Omaramagao, where they'd gone to this all-day Bible
Passion play
thing, and it was always in the back of my mind, and I realized that oh my gosh, 2020 is coming up, and that's one of the years of doing that, and I'm a pastor, so I could try to lead a trip. And so I had, at St. Mary's where I served, I got permission to lead that, and we had people signed up. And then there was sort of the irony of the fact that a play that had been started in response to a plague, which is a pandemic really, right, had to get postponed because of a pandemic. This little town, and it's a little town in 9 years out of 10, has 750,000 people from around the world go there during this April through October of this Passion Play, and that is the last thing you want to do during 2020. And so I remember when they postponed the play, and they didn't push it 1 year, they pushed it 2 years. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, they pushed it to 2022. And now lately I've been are we gonna go? Is this gonna actually happen? But I did, I started leading a class before the world closed in Lent of 2020 about the history of this Passion Play and how this little village has really been shaped by telling this story. And I would love to get past the second lesson. It's a 6-week video course that, there's a little video clip and then there's conversation. And, I still think the idea of this little town shaped by this is cool, and maybe I'll get to go. And if you'd like to maybe go with me, you can talk to me.
Is it in
because
German?
we're definitely maybe going.
But they have.
It's in Oberammergau, Germany.
But I mean, they speak it in German.
Yeah, it's in German. I know. In hindsight, if I had like just started learning German at the beginning of the pandemic, but I didn't.
Yeah, even some of the little houses have paintings on the outside of the house, so that you can go through and see some of the, it's almost like the Stations of the Cross.
Yeah, and apparently, because it's a small town, basically anyone with any spare room in their house turns their house into a bed and breakfast. And so you end up, so my tour guide contacty person said that they can't promise it'll happen, but at least one time they had someone staying at a house, and the person woke up in the morning and, you know, had their breakfast, and they're like, oh my gosh, Jesus is serving me breakfast. Because literally everyone gets involved in the thing. And in order to, you have to, in order to be involved, you have, like, you can be a bed and breakfast, but in order to be in the orchestra or the cast or the crew or anything, you have to have been born and raised there, or have lived in the village for 20 years, and then you can apply.
Oh my God.
So it's to make it truly their thing, and not like, you know, professionals descending in. And so.
Pastor Karen, I heard somewhere along the line that you like to travel. Will you tell us about a fun trip that you took or something that's on the bucket list?
Yeah, traveling. So I will narrow that down very tightly. RV camping travel is really, I was fortunate to receive a year's sabbatical in my last call, and one of the things I put in there was a month renting a Cruise America truck, and that my husband and our chocolate lab took and followed the Lewis and Clark Trail heading west. And we fell into this lovely rhythm of traveling and just seeing the beautiful, really, North Dakota and Montana. We loved it. And I think that has been that combination of being in nature and a cushy house on wheels. So we ended up purchasing an RV and still do that. Our longest trip has maybe been a couple of weeks. We tend to navigate sort of the post-Easter trip is to the Carolinas, Tennessee, Smoky Mountains, maybe down to the coast. We really find that refreshing. We love the hiking. I'll bring my bike and we'll find the bike trails, and we bring the dog. So that's been our niche. I keep flunking retirement and going back to work. I'm also the caregiver for my mother. She's in assisted living, so I'm not leaving longer than a couple weeks at a time. But we see another season in our life may be coming, and we'll be that couple living in our RV for extended time. So.
Thank you. I'm Leah. I realized I forgot to introduce
okay,
myself
Leah.
at the beginning of that question.
Are you a traveler?
I am. Yeah. I'm going
So what's on your bucket list, Pastor Karen?
On my bucket list? So the Lewis and Clark stalled at Coeur d'Alene, and that night in the campground there was a biker group, and we were debating how far we would have to turn around and head back. We were running out of time. And ran into this biker group, and we're like, oh gosh, these crazy loud neighbors. And but the dog had to go for a walk by the bikers, and the dog pulled in, smelling the hot dogs. And it turns out just really nice group of guys, professional men out on their Harleys, and they said you've got to do Oregon and the Columbia River and finish it. So thank you. That's to finish Lewis and Clark would be fun, and then find whatever biking trail I can on the way.
Fun.
That's a fun question. Can I answer it?
Yeah.
Well, you don't even want the fun one.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've crossed off my bucket list is getting my kids excited about travel and being kind of adventurous or wanting to do new things, because I really wanted them to get bitten by the travel bug. And so a couple of years ago, we were gifted with a trip to London and Paris. We got to take our kids there. And like on the plane ride home, my son said to me, you know, I think there's probably more to see in Paris. Are we going to go back? I was like, there's more to see because we only spent 2 days there. But I was like, yes, cross that one off the list. But my my next bucket list item that I really, really want to do is that I want to make pasta by hand with a real Italian grandma in Italy.
That's very specific.
I don't just want to go and like take the pictures. I want to like
Experience it.
yeah.
Are there grandmas for rent if you don't,
There
if you don't know any?
like
Seriously?
places where you can go and get
She's
invited.
researched it.
I have. And get invited into their house and they'll teach you how to make pasta.
That's fantastic.
It's not just a fantasy,
No.
it's a real potential.
It is. So there.
Next question. Que parle Italiano?
No.
Oh,
All I can say in Italian is por favore no fumare lo asma. So I went to one of my housemates in college found a really cheap like ticket and hotel package to Rome, and so of course that's what we did for spring break. And I was very asthmatic at the time when I was in college, and in at least in that time, like I think everyone over 12 smoked in Italy, like everywhere. There would be like ashtrays under no smoking signs. It was clear that someone made them put them up, but there was like no attempt. So like basically we went to churches and museums because those are the only places that you can't smoke. So like we didn't go into restaurants because it was just like thick. So we'd like eat on the street. And I would try that. I learned how to say that so I could at least tell like the one time we took a taxi, like please don't smoke near me. But Rome was amazing. Just very, very smoky.
Is it still that way these days? Does
I don't
anyone
know. I haven't been back. I know at the time. And then neither of us spoke Italian. Our plan was I had taken Spanish and she had taken Latin, and we figured Italian was roughly in the middle of those two. And that mostly Europeans speak English. So it worked out mostly with my one sentence.
So I have a question for all three of you. I want to know, well, I'm Beth. I want to know if you had some kind of conversion experience to become a pastor, or if it was sort of a slow awakening. What really was it that called you to be a pastor? And I'd like to hear from all three of you.
Not me first.
I'm going to go first. I'll give you two sides. So I was a psych major in college. I didn't know what I was going to do with that worthless major. So I went on to seminary. That seemed to be working out. My senior year of seminary, my dad sits me down and says, Karen, I have to tell you, when I was 20, this was just the end of World War II. He said I had the chance to be a pilot and go into this pilot training. And he said I wanted it so badly that I prayed to God that I would promise one of my sons would become a pastor if I could get into the schooling. Now, I told you, I have 4 brothers, and I'm the only girl. And he's telling me this my senior year of seminary. I'm about to be a pastor. So he's cleared his conscience of this whole thing. And I'm still wondering if that's why I became a pastor. I don't believe in bargaining prayers, but sometimes.
Did you become a pilot?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Yes, that's the end of the story. He becomes a pilot, has a great 2-year experience of that, and goes on to get married and have a family, and yeah.
So he had given up on all the brothers, and he said, it falls to you?
I know, exactly. That's why I'm like 4th out of 5 children too, so.
Are any of your brothers pastors?
No. I know. Thank you, that's important detail, just how strange that is. So, yeah, that might be why. I'm going to stay with that. Obviously, there's a lot of pieces that go into that discernment process. And when you get farther into it, you learn real quickly that the church is also going to say, we are going to discern your calling as well. So I think that's true for all of us, that you have a sense of what is the right thing for you to do, and then you trust the people around you to help you give positive feedback. And that's good discernment process. Like even now for your next pastor, that you're all praying about this and you're supporting your call committee and you give input. I mean, it's a communal decision making. And so I would say I grew up in the ELCA congregation, but a large church similar to St. Matt's. And in the culture of the 70s, you would get confirmed and then voila, you're all done. There was no youth ministry. There was no place. And I remember distinctly having a lot of questions at that stage in my life of what is this all about? And there was nowhere to go except the choir. So I'd sit in the choir. And that led me into college and studying psychology. So for me, the spiritual was a really internal, understanding who is God and, what is this all about and what does Scripture mean? It wasn't until I got to seminary I learned this other path. Some people are really driven by cultural concerns and the need for justice and for doing the right thing. I was over in this psychology world that I ended up in seminary for that. And no wonder I'm into life application. You can see that all kind of fits together. And so I think the doors opened for me to go to seminary. When I got to seminary, a third of us were women by that time, so that door had already been opened. And my first interview, first call, the doors just kept opening. And honestly, I don't know if you two felt, I'm 26 and a pastor going, oh, how can they really trust me? So that would be, I think, an honest description of the journey. Okay.
I also grew up in the Lutheran Church. My grandfather and his 2 brothers were pastors. I have an uncle who's a pastor. In fact, he was a missionary in Japan, and he married my aunt, I guess. But so at a large family reunion, there would always be a church service because we'd have a ton of pastors. Mm-hmm. But they're all men. I was the first woman, the only one so far. And I didn't think about being a pastor as a kid. I remember, going to Sunday school and knowing all the stories and asking questions and things like that. I was interested in a wide variety of things, and I couldn't figure out what to major in. And the college I went to didn't make us decide until middle of your sophomore year, which was both nice and they still actually make you decide at a certain point. And so during my end of my freshman year, beginning of my sophomore year, I was just doing a lot of maybe I'll be a poli-sci major, maybe I'll be a biology major, maybe I'll be a history, not even adjacent fields. And in different parts of my life, people would very randomly say, have you ever considered being a pastor? And I'd be like, where did that come from? And I would think about it, and I would come up with reasons why that was a stupid idea, and then I would just get it out of my head, and then I would randomly run into the son of the pastor that I grew up with at a restaurant in the Twin Cities. What? And then he would be like, hey, have you ever considered being a pastor? Mm-hmm. There's so much how did this happen in the story, And so that just kept happening, and it felt like the thought was just sort of this creeping question. And I had some pretty airtight reasons why it wasn't going to work. I was not a great Spanish student, and you'd have to go to seminary. You have to learn Greek and Hebrew, and those don't even have our alphabet. One of them doesn't even go in the right direction. And so I was like, so clearly, God, that disqualifies me. And also, the other big one was that I did not read, and I was late. Learning to read was really hard for me, and I hated reading out loud. I had pretty much, almost like a low-level panic attack if I was called upon to read out loud, like through high school. And I was like, pastors read out loud, like minimum the gospel every week, minimum. And so I thought that was definitely a deal breaker. But I was working in the office of the chaplain, and I loved that job, and I loved the chaplain, and she's like, well, you know what, why don't you just try reading scripture in chapel? Because, there's like, if we had this level attendance, we would have done a party dance, right? So it's in front of a small, and so I just started doing it, and it wasn't as terrible. But the final sort of moment when I accepted the call, I had been stewing about what to major in, and I couldn't, and so I was living in Religious Diversity House, which had been a house before the college owned it. So the room that I shared with my roommate was like the formal dining room when it had been a normal family. And so you open the door and you're in the kitchen. And one of my housemates was making macaroni and cheese, and he just looked up at me and he said, you're going to be a Lutheran pastor, now stop worrying and go do your homework. And I just had this sense of peace that like, yeah, I am going to do this. And after being so like pinballing around about what to do, it hasn't left. And so even when I have wanted to not be called to this, because it's not always easy, I have still always felt a sense of call to this. And I would tell people, especially in college, like, why are you going to go to seminary? Be like, well, it's better than being swallowed by a fish. And they'd look at me and be like, what? But, sort of I think if you're called to ministry, God will just keep calling until you go. And unless you feel that call, I wouldn't recommend it, because it's hard. I don't know. It's hard work, and every job is, but it's just, I don't know. So my favorite part about that is that the gentleman who was this bringer of peace has no recollection of that and denies ever saying it, because we spent the next 5 years periodically in person and over email debating whether or not women should be ordained.
Wow.
So he's a professor at Catholic University. Like he and Pope Benedict were like this in terms of theology. So I was like, well, you were involved in my call story whether you like it or not. And I'll no, I wasn't. I would not. Too bad.
I was fascinated when the bishop was here, and he kind of told his story about how he ended up majoring in religious studies in college, because that's how I ended up majoring in religious studies. It was like all of a sudden it was first semester my junior year in college, and my advisor said to me, I really appreciate how you're like pushing the limits of a liberal arts education in refusing to choose a major, because that's really what liberal arts education is. I really appreciate you modeling this, but now you have to choose a major. And so we just like looked at the classes that I'd taken, and he said, if you take 2 more classes in religious studies, you'll be a religion major. And I was like, fine, like I'll do that. then I'll get a degree and I'll finish in 4 years like I promised my parents. And so I did that. I sat at the graduation ceremony at Luther College and I was like, wait, does this mean I don't get to take any more religion classes? Like at graduation, while someone was speaking with such a thick Norwegian accent, I couldn't understand what they were saying. So I went to seminary and I was like, I'm just going to take some classes until I figure out what I really want to do. And then it was, I'll take another year of classes because then I can have a Master of Arts in Theology and I won't have wasted this time. And then it was, okay, I'll go on internship and I'll actually try out what this is. So it was always one step at a time, and every step along the way there is this process where the church kind of has a conversation with you and makes you write essays and do all these things all along the way to make sure that it's not just you thinking you're going to be a good pastor, but the church thinking that you're going to be a good pastor too. And I really resisted that because I had a lot of doubts and I had a lot of questions. And in my experience, the church wasn't very open to those things, and I didn't want to be a part of the thing that squashed my questions. And I didn't like the way the church at the time treated LGBTQ people. I didn't want to be a part of that. So I resisted a lot, and every time I had to get together to have one of these interviews, I said to all my classmates, this is it, I'm going to get kicked out, right? Because I'm going to tell them exactly what I think, and then they're going to kick me out. And so every step along the way, I was sure that I was just going to that somebody was going to make the decision for me to get out of this track. And instead, they were like, wow, somehow they appreciated that instead of kicking me out. And I was like, I really thought this was going to be the end, and it wasn't going to have to be me. Somebody was going to do it to me, right? And then, so I kind of kept going along this track, and finally one of my mentors said to me, because in my head I had this idea that the pastor had to have all the answers, the pastor had to have this unshakable faith, the pastor had to stand in the pulpit with this booming voice, because that's the kind of pastor I grew up with, and had to live in such a way that nobody would question their values or their morality or how good they were, and they certainly never would say it in adult forum or anything like that. That's a YouTube channel. And so finally one of my mentors said to me, maybe there's room in the church, and maybe there are people in the church who want a pastor that's the opposite of that, who wants a pastor that will say, I don't know the answer. This is hard for me too. I have doubts about that. I make all kinds of mistakes in my life and don't live up to what it means to be a child of God every single day. And they need to hear somebody say that. Have you ever thought that there are people like you who are sitting in the pews who want the pastor to say that from up front? And then I was like, busted. Yeah, busted. So that's how I got into all of this, and that's why I try in preaching and in Bible study and in everything I do to be really honest about, I don't know what this passage means, or I don't know what this author was trying to do, or to say, I don't believe this at all, or I got in trouble for this. I preached about the woman who comes to Jesus and she says, even the dogs get the crumbs under the table, and Jesus calls her a dog. And from the pulpit I said, I don't like Jesus in this story. Jesus is upsetting me in this story. And somebody came up to me and it was like, oh my gosh, you can't say that. You can't say that Jesus made you angry, you know? And so, but I did.
And I thought it was a great sermon. I remember that sermon.
So that's my story. Yeah.
Can I just make a comment about the wonderful continuity here that all of you have talked about, how the community, the people of God, helped, were part of your call. People of God.
I told Ann and Sheila this story this last week. You recognize you have 3 women pastors in front of you. And that's just a fluke or the work of the Holy Spirit to just say, you know, they're pastors ready to serve, and we're available to serve. And gender was not in the equation. It was just 3 pastors. And for any of you baby boomer feminists out there, you know, that's all we were looking for. And I told Ann and Sheila this week that my first call had, it was just a reception during the service. I'm 26, 27 years old, from Minnesota. We don't do direct confrontation. So someone came up to me and said, women shouldn't be pastors. And I told Ann, I walked out of the room, went to the bathroom, and cried my eyes out. That was my response. And then I had to kind of work up. The reality was, even now I'm 60 years old, my church had, when I was 9 years old, decided women could be pastors. And that wasn't a decision I had anything to do with. It simply had opened a door for the daughters of our congregations to walk through that door. And when you mentioned LGBTQ, we have made that decision as a denomination to open that door. And as we're talking about how mergers can take 30 years, a whole generation, we almost have to realize that some of these changes are going to be very slow, for better or worse. That's where the church, in its greater wisdom, has decided we want to go. And we'll see. We're going to live into that. And now here you are today. For me, 34 years in ministry. These pastors, I'm sure over 10, are just a team of 3 women since today.
I always know how long I've been ordained because Jacob was a baby. So if Jacob is 13, I've been ordained for 13 years.
There you go.
It's super helpful.
Yeah. Thank you, Petey. Any other questions?
I just thought I'd let you know about a person that I know who is a pastor. He was a very interesting person. I was in engineering and bridges and structures, and I came to work one day, and here's this man with a big beard, and he introduces himself. He says, I am Michael Yudaikong. He says, I am from Nigeria. Oh, I was pleased to meet you. He had 2 engineering degrees. Very intelligent man. And the first thing he asked me is, we played the radio, you know, elevator music. He said, can we listen to the religious station? I said, sure. So we listened to, I forget which one it was, WVCY, religious, and they talked. 2 years later, I come to work and he's packing his stuff. And I said, Michael, where are you leaving? He says, Don, I am going to become a Lutheran pastor. He went to seminary. He came back. I went to his ordination. I was so enamored with this man. He was such a man of God. I said, Michael, you've come halfway around the world to serve God. He said, I will go anywhere he sends me. And he's a pastor in a Lutheran church just on the border of Illinois and Indiana. And about 25 years now.
Someone has already said to me that our next pastor needs to be a man so that we can restore some balance here. And I said, I think it's going to take about 100 years to restore the balance here.
We never said that when there were 3 men in charge.
No.
Yep.
No, because as I understand it, you had Pastor Margaret, so like second, third, and fourth female pastor ever. We just happened to have doubled the total in the last 6
It's only
months.
been 100 years.
Well, Pastor Margaret started the Wednesday morning Bible class, and one of the things that she did is she brought a friend who was a rabbi. And that particular class, he was talking about the honor of reading the ancient texts. And he said, we think we know what they meant, but he said languages evolve over the centuries. And he says the words that they used then for meaning may not mean the same today. He says, but we're pretty darn sure we knew what they meant. She had wonderful classes. And that's how it started. And yay.
When I was in seminary, over half of the seminary students were women. And from what I have heard, the enrollment in seminary there's a pretty significant LGBTQ enrollment, at least at Luther.
And a second career.
And a lot of second career. There were a lot of women who had felt called to ministry, but didn't grow up in, like if you're a woman and you feel called to ministry and you are in a denomination that doesn't ordain women, then you're kind of like stuck in trying to figure out what to do with this call. And so some of them had felt God calling them, and then they finally went to seminary at like 50. You know, like they were sending their youngest to college, and so they went to seminary as well. And there were also, you know, a lot of people who had started in some other career, teaching, nursing, anything really, who eventually that call had just kept coming, and so eventually they uprooted their families and moved to seminary. One of the things that they've started more recently is a distance learning program, because one of the big challenges was if you are coming directly out of college and are either unmarried or recently married and don't have any kids or career or furniture, it's not a big deal to just go to wherever the seminary is. But if you have children who are in school, or you have a spouse with a job, or you know, sort of any of those established life things, it's a much bigger deal to uproot and go to seminary. And it's the way it's designed, it's many moves. So you move from wherever you are to seminary, where you have 2 years of school, and then you move to someplace else to do internship, and then you move back to seminary for a 4th year, and then you get assigned, and it's like joining the army. You can be like, I would really like to be a cook, and they're like, okay, motor pool. And it's like that. You know, like, I really feel called to like urban ministry, and they're like, fine, South Dakota. You know, and it's not always, but it can be. And you have to take your first call where they send you. And so you can take your second call, you can put your paperwork in to where you wanted to go in the first place, but there's just a whole lot of family upheaval moving. And so the distance learning allows for more staying put, but there were a lot of students who commuted, and they would commute like
3 hours.
5 hours, like they would stay over. There were some who would commute several hours, and they'd go back and forth, and there was others who, you know, were living apart from their spouse for the, you know, whole semester, or...
But that said, we need pastors, we need lay professionals, so you know anyone, tap their shoulder.
I want to just follow up on that, what you just said, Pastor Sheila, because I think that's really interesting. So the trust that you have to have as pastoral, in training or candidates, the trust you have to have in the process, and then, you're being sent somewhere where you have to go, right? Was that ever difficult for any of you? And I know are you laughing, Ann?
Yeah.
Just like how did you negotiate or navigate that trust in what you were being told to do and in what maybe your heart said, and then where's God in that? I mean,
that was a huge thing for me. I had a different candidacy committee than you did. You go through candidacy, the process of the church kind of affirming your call through the synod that your home congregation is in. My home congregation is in Metro Chicago, and Metro Chicago Synod has historically been, I'm going to go with cruel to their candidates because they've had so many, and my very first candidacy thing was this orientation and entrance event thing, and the assistant to the bishop stands up and says, okay, so as you can see, there are a lot of you. I've got a couple things that you just need to know. You're going to go to seminary, and you're going to meet other people from other synods, and you're going to hear about retreats and mentors and scholarships. We don't do any of that stuff. Don't ask. And if you think you're here and you want to serve in the Chicagoland area, leave now. There's juice and donuts over here. And I was like, well, that was welcoming.
Wow.
And then, I went to Luther, and I was and there was a desire that I had not done that there's a Chicago seminary, and so they're used to dealing with people who go to the Chicago seminary, and so, everything that could go wrong did, and so it was this internal sense of God is calling me to this, and I kept being could you lift a finger to make this not terrible? Because I'm divorced now, but I got married the summer after my first year. And so I dutifully sent a letter to my synod telling them I'm not going to be taking the clinical education because I'm getting married, and it didn't seem like those things would fit well together or whatever. And they're and I got a phone call being that's just fine, thanks for letting us know. And then months later, I get this email being can you tell us what your name is going to be after you're married? And we're looking forward to you doing CPE in the spring or in the fall. And I was I said I was going to do it in the next summer, and it was this whole miscommunication. And they sent me this letter that they had never actually. They sent me a copy of a letter, but it was dated in November when I had told them. But it had an address that I'd moved to after Easter, so I was well, this doesn't feel legit. Anyway, we had all of these arguments about but they're yeah, rules are rules. I had no way of knowing about it. Oh, that's too bad. Because we can't even accept your interviews for the next stage until you do the thing. And then they were well, we'll let you do it during the whatever trimester. And I was we're not even on trimester. It was just this forever obnoxious thing. So I wound up with extra time because I wasn't allowed to go on internship. And so that's when I had my first child. And then I finally went on internship, and I went to North Dakota, and that was I was done with all my classes. I had nothing else to do. And they paired people up at the seminary, and the phone call I got was, yeah, we've given out all of the churches that you wanted, but we've got this great list of church, and it was there was the leftover barrel that no one had wanted. And so they ended up sending me to this internship that was just so ill thought out, because I had an off-site supervisor, and Metro Chicago had told me that they specifically don't allow off-site supervisors, and I'm they're gonna fail me. It was this whole, and then eventually after like having the internship between the two churches, it was just, eventually the seminary is like, yeah, you know what? This is untenable, so we're gonna just bring you back, except I'm done with classes. Like, it was just, so but internships only start once a year. So then I had to, ironically, the best paying job on campus was working in the development office. And so I'm really angry at the church and at the seminary, and my job is to literally write thank you letters to the big donors. So that was interesting to like figure out the, like, what can I ethically say to fulfill my job when I'm angry. And then eventually I did do internship, which was great, out in Washington. But my internship supervisor tried to appeal that they would do my final interview thing early. He's like, I've had 15 interns, and she's the best one I've ever had. You need to do this. And they're like, no, we don't. And they were like, God must have other plans for you. And I was like, you don't get to say that when you're literally the one blocking the way. Like, if someone slams the door on you and your fingers, they don't get to be like, oh, God must have had other plans for your fingers. You know, and so it was just this forever, like, are you kidding? So then I would end up having to wait to have this set of interviews, and then you have to have these interviews before you can be assigned to wherever in the world you're going to be assigned to, and it was this whole big thing. And so I was like, well, I guess I'll have another kid because I have time. So I used all of these interruptions as my maternity leave. So I ended up working, living in my aunt and uncle's basement, and working as the pastoral, I was the interim associate, but I wasn't ordained, so I wasn't allowed to have that title. And then eventually I was able to have this interview. It also got postponed another step because my faculty interview had been like right after the last faculty meeting, and the interview or whatever, it would happen like after, like 2 weeks before the faculty would meet again or something. Like, it was just all of these like bureaucratic, like my call and competency were never in question. It was all like, oh, you didn't fill out Form W. What's Form W? Oh, yeah, you know, so it was just all of this ridiculousness. And then the final one was like, you are kidding me. Because I called, because I'd had the email being like, all right, well, your interview is going to be Friday, January 4th, or whatever it was. And I looked at the calendar, and January 4th was a Saturday. So it was like, and it was going on a Saturday and a Sunday, so it was, or Saturday and Friday. So it was like, okay, well, which one is it? And they're like, oh, we'll call you back. Turns out the secretary, who had been my nemesis through this whole thing, had failed to schedule this interview.
Oh no.
And if I didn't have this interview, I was going to have to wait another 6 months to be able to have this interview, and then another 3 months to be eligible to be sent somewhere. And I was just like, I just started laughing. So I was like, this is ridiculous. Sheila, who does this happen to?
Credits are playing.
Sorry.
Yeah, this is faith, and you're here.
And so I have the spiritual gift of stubbornness. And that's all whether I want it or not.
And
So sorry, it's a long story.
I just want to say thank you for taking interest in us. In the short time we're here, and it's a pleasure to be working with these pastors.
Pleasure to be working with you, and Pastor Karen especially was reluctant to do this because who would want to know anything about me? So clearly there's an interest, and it's really nice. This is a relational church. Maybe it has something to do with the transparency and the authentic sharing you all did today, and men can do that too, but I really love just saying. But I loved hearing the stories today and all the great questions. So thanks for being here. We'll do it again.
Thank you.
All right.